Dear participants, warm welcome to this seminar on a very difficult, complex, and yet a crucial topic of how to improve workers' rights while doing business in China. For those who don't know me, my name is Therese Svanström, and I am the president of TCO. TCO is the Swedish Confederation for Professional Employees. And I'm proud to say we're a growing trade union organization with 1.4 million members in 13 affiliated trade unions. Our members are key public servants. They are teachers, nurses, journalists, policemen, cultural workers, such as actors and musicians. But you can also find our members in multinational, medium and small enterprises in the so-called new economy, working as IT consultants, software engineers, IT project managers, and so on. As you can hear, it's a wide variety of white-collar workers and managers in both private and public sector. I'm very happy that we have so many prominent and knowledgeable panelists with us here today. It is representatives from various stakeholders, among other trade unions, academia, government officials, and NGOs. And they will guide us through this seminar and give us their valuable inputs, thoughts, and of course also expertise on these challenges when it comes to workers' rights in China, but also ways forward, how we can make a difference together. I very much look forward to the discussion, so warm welcome to all panelists. And so why do we have this seminar today, one could ask. For me, as a trade unionist, the answer is clear. Our engagement and our work for democracy and fundamental human rights, including trade union and workers' rights, do not and cannot stay at the borders of Sweden. On the contrary, human rights, including workers' rights, are universal and see no borders, and can only be, and it's only by ensuring that all workers enjoy the same rights in Sweden, in China, and elsewhere in the world that we can fulfill our trade union promise and mission, I think. TCO is also a warm friend of free and fair trade. We strongly believe that increased trade contributes to economic growth and prosperity for our members and for societies as a whole. But we do not believe in trade at any cost, of course. We can only accept free trade when it's free for all, equally distributed, sustainable, and responsible with respect for fundamental rights and freedoms. And we believe that trade and trade agreements can be a useful tool for to push for these rights and freedoms. These issues and more, of course, will be discussed from various perspectives in two panels today, one on trade policies and another one on business practices. And I hope and I believe that this discussion from this seminar will contribute to further develop our policy towards China. And with those words, I would like to wish you all a fruitful discussion, and I would like to give the floor, or what you do call it in this digital era, to our moderator of today, Gustav Sundqvist. Gustav, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Therese, and I'm so proud of being here. And since I know many of you are perhaps not that familiar with China and the recent development in China, I will start by giving a very brief presentation of the recent development in China, and also a presentation on how China challenges democratic trade unions. I will also, I want to note you that this seminar, it will be recorded and you can ask questions in the chat. And then some of my colleagues will bring up the questions to the panels that will follow this presentation. So how does China challenge democratic trade unions, and how do China challenge our way of doing business while still protecting human rights? As most of you know, China's economy has been growing really quick during the last 40 years. And since the Western world, most Western countries didn't handle Corona very well, so now many predicts that China actually will overtake US position as the world's largest economy in 2028. So it's only in 7 years China may become the world's largest economy. China already invests a lot of money in Europe, and as you see in this map, it invests mainly in the big 3 European economies, UK, France, Germany, but also actually a lot in Sweden and Finland. And Europe also trade a lot with China. I think last year, China surpassed USA as Europe's biggest external trading partner. So trade is increasing. China is quickly becoming a technological superpower. You see here that the number of peer-reviewed articles published by Chinese scholars increased very quickly. And the country is also home to a great number of large, innovative, competitive international companies. And this in comparison to the Soviet Union, the last great power that to some extent challenged Western liberal democracies. The Soviet Union didn't have this large competitive international companies. In Sweden, I think Huawei is the most famous among these ones. How should trade unions respond to China then? China provides a number of challenges to trade unions. I will go through them one by one. Sorry. Firstly, there are many accusations from both companies and trade unions that competition with China is actually unfair, that being some kind of a command economy still, China is subsidizing a lot of their big companies. Some of China's big companies are sometimes called national champions. They might, the state might give them a lot of subsidies in order to make them more competitive on the international scene, and then they can outcompete other international companies. And China is also accused of shielding some parts of their market that are open for Chinese companies when they invest in Europe, for one example. Last year, in December last year, in 2020, the EU and China agreed on investment agreement, or on a suggestion to an investment agreement. I think the European Parliament still have to ratify it if it should become real. And this agreement is to a great part addressing these questions that, for one example, technology transfer, which has been a big problem before when European companies do investments in China, it becomes forbidden if this new investment agreement is initiated. Another problem, of course, very big problem for democratic trade unions is there are limited rights for workers and unions in China. ACFTU, All China Federation of Trade Unions, is on paper a very, very big Chinese trade union, but it is closely affiliated to China's ruling Communist Party, And in fact, I would say that it works as a Chinese ministry. So it's not that is unimportant. It has been progressive in pushing forward some progressive labor laws in China, but it is not a democratic trade union, and it must put a lot of emphasis on securing the interest by the Communist Party. Another problem in China is, of course, environmental degradation. During the early 21st century, CO2 emissions in China increased really, really rapidly, as you see in this graph. During the recent 10 years, it has been on some kind of a plateau. And now we hope that it will decrease. I think if you compare environmental issues and human rights issues, I am more positive when it comes to environmental issues in China, since China invests a lot in green technology, for one example. Another challenge with trade unions' relationship to China is the suppression of freedom in Hong Kong. You know, in 2019, it was this big demonstrations in Hong Kong, but China, the Chinese central government maybe used the corona epidemic as an opportunity to crush the democratic opposition in Hong Kong. And now, which is especially sensitive for trade unions, is that many trade union leaders in Hong Kong has actually been arrested. Another big problem is suppression against minorities, and especially the Uyghur minority, a Muslim people living in the northwestern Chinese province of Xinjiang. There have been many reports about labor camps where hundreds of thousands or even millions of Uyghurs might be in these labor camps. And one reason to be there can be that you just you express your faith in Islam, for one example. You have a beard, you have the Quran at home, and so on. There has been increasing conflict, especially on this Uyghur question, between the European Union and China. And I think it was in March, the European Union sanctioned 10 Chinese officials that were seen as responsible for the suppression of the Uyghurs. China responded by sanctioning 10 European politicians, but also researchers. One of them, which you see on the picture, my dear colleague, Björn Gerdén, he was the only Swedish person who was sanctioned. And also the same week as this sanctions took place, China's boycott against the Swedish company H&M was initiated. And this was because H&M has a ban of buying cotton from Xinjiang. So in summary, China is becoming an economic superpower. And China's rise implies a number of severe challenges for democratic trade unions. And now I think it's high time for trade unions to develop concrete strategies on how to respond to these challenges. So this is the end of my introduction. And now I would like that all of the panelists in panel 1 that you shut on your camera so we can see you. And in panel 1, I will introduce you. We have, first of all, Karolina Zurek. You are Senior Advisor at the National Board of Trade Sweden. Then we have Malin, Head of Stockholm's office of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. Then we also have Cecilia Ekholm, Ambassador for Sustainable Business at Sweden's Foreign Ministry. Then we have Oskar Wåglund Söderström, International Director at TCO. Then we have also Andreas Botsch. You must, if I don't pronounce your name well, you must say Andreas. Trade unionist at the German Trade Union Confederation, GGB, which, if I understand it right, it's one of Germany's largest trade union confederations. So I start actually to give a question to Oscar. TCO is positive to international trade, but at any cost. What issues do you see from a trade union perspective, Oscar?
Well, thank you very much, Gustav, for the introduction. It's very interesting and great to see all the panelists. It's right that our president, Therese Svanström, just said that we have a fundamentally positive view on free trade. This country's economy is heavily dependent on trade, and not only on exports, but also on imports, that many of them, of course, come from China. And many of our members in the private sector, not least, work in companies dependent on long and very complicated value chains. And we know from centuries of experience that trade is good for the economy. During the past decades, globalization has contributed to lifting millions of people worldwide out of poverty. But even if we know that trade leads to growth, it doesn't by itself lead to inclusive growth, for instance, that to quality jobs and improved right for workers. And I think the China example, as you showed, Gustav, is quite a true example of that. That even in China, for instance, even if working conditions, material conditions have become better during the past decades, we have a repression and surveillance that is increasing with non-existent freedom of speech, complete absence of independent trade unions. You mentioned the crackdown in Xinjiang and the systematic introduction of repression in Hong Kong, for instance. I think that's perfect examples of this, that trade doesn't automatically lead to human rights. So is TCO positive to this kind of international trade at any cost? It goes without saying that as a trade unionist, we believe that trade must never lead to or even be used as an excuse to use bad conditions for workers or to breach fundamental rights. So this cost, if there is one, needs to be significantly reduced because free trade needs to be fair to work. So I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, how can trade and EU trade policy help to improve the situation for workers, to make sure that trade union rights and other human rights are respected? How can trade help to reduce CO2 emissions for environmental sustainability? You showed that in one of your slides, for instance, Gustav. How can trade be used for an inclusive recovery from the pandemic and that workers worldwide can become the true winners of globalization? Because we know that trade slowdown have also made millions of people falling back into poverty now worldwide. Well, the answer to all this is not trade policy measures alone, but it's clear that trade could serve as an engine for improvement for workers, but it needs to be combined with other things as well, like investments in education, health policy, environmental protection, and of course in institutions that uphold human rights. So trade policy can be a tool, and the EU needs to serve as a global role model here, I think. And just to wrap up on China, which is of course a very, very complex problem, that's why we have the seminar today. What can we do to improve the human rights situation in a country that we are so dependent on when it comes to trade and investments, but with a track record that is so bad on human rights and it's just becoming worse? And I think, well, one answer is that the way forward is not to trade less. And I don't think the answer is to start a Trump-style tariff war that has also been tried. So what is our leverage towards a country that is not interested at all in improving the situation? That is the $1 million question or €1 million question. And I'm sure we'll come back to Kai, the investment agreement and so on, but it's part of a broader question that how should we deal with China from the European side? And what can the EU do? What can we do with the US, with the new administration? Where do we need multilateral solution? And what is our leverage? Can we look at other regions' free trade agreements, for instance? And I don't have the answer here, but that's why we have the seminar. So I'm really looking forward to hear the experts coming up with a good recipe for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Oscar. I would just note everyone again that this seminar will be recorded and that you can put in, you can ask questions in the chat. I would like to pass the word to Andreas. What are the German experience when it comes to this? How can trade unions protect the rights of workers and also sustainability when doing business with China?
Thanks a lot, Gustav, and thanks for having me in this round. I believe before I really get to the core of your question, I'd like to set out a few sort of fundamental basics, which are pretty much in line of what Oscar was just saying. We are observing an intensive course of repressive modernization of China towards domestic politics, while at the same time China is intensifying, and that corresponds with the internal course of politics. China is intensifying its hegemonial policies towards the exterior. This is the general framework. And China has started using trade in a framework of coercive diplomacy for quite a while now. You mentioned the HMN case in Sweden. There have been deep controversies with Korea, with Australia, with Norway, and most recently with Belgium. So if a country does not comply with the Chinese view of the world, or let's say with Chinese rules and standards, there is obviously a kind of diplomatic, but then also economic fine. Look at the external expansion of China's pretension of becoming a new hegemony all along the Belt and Road countries, where China has provided what I would personally call vulture loans to the countries along that road, but it is also increasingly doing that in Africa. And this is why it is important to keep in mind that since accession to the WTO, where most countries believed that there would be change through business, we have to realize now that it is the opposite that that has occurred. It is business rather than change. Turning to your question, it is very difficult if you do not operate on the same basis of arguments with anyone you have a dialogue with. Rather than believing that the old Western set of values ultimately will remain valid for everyone, we have to state that it is now China trying to dictate the rules, which may be legitimate from a Chinese standpoint. We should not forget that China, up until the mid-19th century, was a global player, had enormous influence in the globe, and what they regard, how they regard the situation now is that they're not a newcomer, they're not a newly developing country, but they're going back to their place in the world which belonged to them traditionally. So the Chinese point of view is important to know. As to us in Germany, you may know from global trade statistics that in terms of turnover, meaning exports and imports, China has become the most important trading partner to Germany. The turnover has amounted to 213 billion euros in 2020, out of a total of 2.23 trillion last year. So that makes Chinese trade turnover with Germany almost 10% of overall foreign German trade, just to show you the dimension. There's certainly not an easy reply to, oh, let's dig out all the tools we have in trade protection, but there are a number of serious matters, and that includes the comprehensive agreement with China, between the EU and China, which will probably never see the light of the day as it stands now. The more that China is increasing pressure on individual EU member states, the more there will be solidarity among the governments in the Council. And obviously, the EU Parliament, as it stands now, will reject the KAI. The KAI itself is also much more symbolic than it brings really progress. We could go into more detail if we have time. We have looked at the KAI in more detail, but it is extremely important that since during the Trump administration, China presented itself as the savior of, or the savers of the multilateral system, and at the same time disturbing the multilateral system of global rules very much. Now that the Trump era is over, at least for the time being, it is extremely important that Europe finds its own way of defining a strategic autonomy vis-a-vis China, and maybe also by forming a new alliance that goes transatlantic. Because we obviously share more the same values with the United States and the labor movement there than we do with China.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And it was very interesting also to hear you getting into this discussion about CAI, this trade investment agreement between European Union and China that probably, as you say, will never see the light of the day due to this increasing conflict between European Union and China. But still, it's interesting to get down in the details of this agreement. And then there I would like to ask you, Karolina, how do you see this EU trade and investment agreement and its possibility to improve workers' rights? Because there were some details about the rights of workers in this agreement, right? So do you think that this agreement could have improved the situation for workers' rights in China? And if not, what would you say would be needed in order to improve the rights of workers in China?
Thank you very much for this question, Gustav. First and foremost, let me clarify that KAI is an investment agreement, not a trade agreement. But I will start by speaking a little bit more broadly about how workers' rights are enshrined in EU's modern trade and investment treaties. So human rights related to the labor market as enshrined in the ILO fundamental conventions are now, as a rule, an established element of modern trade and investment agreements signed by the EU, and they have the place in the so-called trade and sustainable development chapters, which we call TSD chapters, which refer to the parties' commitments in line with the ILO system. So the idea is to use the trade relation between the parties to incentivize and strengthen enforcement of the commitments of both parties towards the ILO conventions and principles. In terms of implementation of these chapters, the EU has chosen a system of implementation and enforcement that is based on constructive dialogue, building a long-term relationship, incentivizing partners, and trying to build common understanding. And this has been one of the main sources of critique towards the EU trade agreements and their relation to sustainability, in accusing them as due to the lack of possibility to involve sanctions in terms of non-compliance, these provisions are toothless. And toothless or not, I would say that despite the fact that these chapters have been implemented only since a couple of years back, we see improvements. We've seen improvements in Vietnam. We've seen improvements now taking place in South Korea after the labor-related TSD dispute under the trade agreement between the EU and Korea. So there are possibilities to incentivize reforms, but they depend very much on the existence. So on the hand, we have the 2030 agenda that sets trade as an engine for inclusive economic growth and sustainable development and raises the bar in what trade is expected to do. On the other hand, we have growing challenges, the socioeconomic aftermath of the COVID crisis that makes this ambition even more difficult to achieve. And critique actually also makes us more self-reflexive. And we can see this self-reflection now in the European Union, where the new trade strategy that has been announced by the Commission actually also announces a review of the way trade and sustainability chapters are implemented and enforced. So we see that the EU is ready to think again, maybe we actually need to adjust, maybe we need new tools, maybe the tools that we have in our toolbox are insufficient in order to face all the new challenges. So there is a trend towards further strengthening of the system.
Thank you very much, Karolina. And I would like to ask you, Malin, if you could have working at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, also this your consultancy company Track 2. Would you say that like this investment agreement, could it improve workers' rights somehow in China, or would it is it just a show that you put in this like clauses about human rights in the investment agreement?
Thank you very much, Gustav. No, I wouldn't call it just for show. Absolutely not. But I think the past 30 years of trade and sort of China's opening up to business with the rest of the world, one conclusion we can draw is that business and trade, just like Andreas said, doesn't automatically lead to more open societies and political reform. And another lesson is that business don't operate in a vacuum. And these trade agreements don't function in a vacuum either. So it is important for businesses to be aware of the political context, the legal context, and also to look back at China's track record in implementing international agreements, including international labor conventions and international human rights treaties that China has ratified. And that is one of the concerns that has been pointed out. Why would the commitments in the sustainability chapter of the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, why would China's performance or implementation of those provisions be different to China's compliance with other treaties that it has agreed to and signed up to? Another, I mean, as Oscar and Andreas mentioned as well, there's also been criticism because of the timing of this agreement. The negotiations of this agreement started 7 years ago. The relations between China and the EU, China and the US looked very different at that time. And this important point that Andreas or Oscar made about leverage, that looks very different now, our leverage in relation to China and what we've seen rather than us doing Wandel durch Handel, we've seen this reverse Wandel durch Handel. So I think those broader power dynamics and the dynamics in the relations between China and the EU definitely needs to be taken into account. And then also sort of the agreement, the CAI has been, as one commentator put it, which I think is very correct, it's been a bit oversold and underpowered. So oversold in terms of the possibilities for the EU to use this agreement as a way to influence China in terms of our values. So I think we need to be more realistic about what this agreement can actually achieve. It can bring some increased market access for European companies in China, which is important, but that's one thing, and that's quite different to improving human rights or labor rights and so forth in China. And now, I mean, because of China's counter-sanctions on European parliamentarians and researchers, the parliament has now voted to freeze the discussions on the CAI. So there we see a very good and prominent example of how we can't operate in silos. We can't sort of keep business and politics separate, but these are integrated, and we can do more to have a more coordinated view of labor rights and human rights in relation to trade agreements and business.
Thank you so much, Malin. I see the time goes quicker than I thought, as is usually the case during this kind of seminars. But I would like to give Cecilia the word before we end this panel and ask you, like an ambassador for sustainable business, how do you think that Swedish foreign ministry can assist companies in China to work in a more sustainable way?
Thank you so much. And you may wonder, why do we have an ambassador for sustainable business? We do have these different thematic ambassadorships where I'm responsible for the policy development and supporting different colleagues and embassies when it comes to items of sustainable business. And it's no surprise that the Swedish government has expressed a very clear expectations on Swedish companies to act sustainably and responsibly when they're in their business abroad by working for human rights, gender equality, good working conditions, and work for the environment, climate, and combating corruption. So there is a very clear expectations on Swedish businesses abroad. And this is coded in not only the platform for international sustainable business that was launched last year, but Sweden actually has a national action plan for business and human rights. And this was adopted in 2015. So we have two main documents, which gives us the policy direction on how we work with the private sector and others when it comes to sustainable business. And that's global, China and other countries. So how do we do this in a more practical term? Might be interesting to know. So as an ambassador for sustainable business, I work on the international in the international part, which is basically connected to our export promotion activities. And we work in what we call Team Sweden. So Team Sweden are the government, the embassies, and all the different export promotion and export financing organizations. And to give you a couple of examples on how the ministry, which is not only the foreign ministry, but there are many more actors who are actually supporting Swedish business out there. So Business Sweden, for example, will demand that companies that they work with abide by the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. They also have a code of conduct, which is freely accessible to all companies, and a sustainability guide for companies that they can use on outside markets. Our export credit agency have in their letter of appropriation that they need to comply and work with, for example, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, the OECD guidelines on multinational companies, the IFC performance standards, and other important instruments. So when they do business, they need to analyze their guarantees and make sure that it does not violate, for example, human rights. And as Karolina mentioned, that there have been certain criticism when it comes to the sustainability chapters. You can see the same thing coming when it comes to the OECD guidelines and the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, because they're voluntary principles. So there has been criticism that this is not enough, voluntary is not enough. So as many of you are listening probably know already, the EU will put forward a proposal on mandatory due diligence on human rights and the environment later on this year. And as Andreas, I'm sure, is aware, that Germany is right now working on national legislation. So we believe it's good to work on the EU level when it comes to these issues, to create a level playing field and to make very clear on an EU level what kind of expectations we have on businesses when it comes to respecting not only human rights, but also the environment. And then just to get into more of the Chinese context, it's in China, we do have some additional features that we do not have in other places. We have, for example, a memorandum of understanding with China on corporate sustainability that was signed in 2007. And under that MOU, we have trained over 1,000 officials and business representatives. There was a website that had over 3 million visits in the year 2008 to 2018. And it has served as a dialogue platform and an interaction platform for sustainability issues. We also have a CSR center at our embassy in Beijing. And that is unique, and not only for Sweden. We do not have a CSR center anywhere else, but it's also unique in China. As far as I know, we're the only country that has this type of cooperation with Chinese authorities. And the CSR center is do a lot of different things and actions. They existed for quite some time. They do, for example, they can organize seminars. They did in April, they did a seminar with the ILO on sustainability in supply chains in China. They do seminars on climate change and climate action. They can act as a platform for Swedish business and other sectoral organizations, and as a point of coordination when it comes to sustainable business issues in China. I think I'll stop there because I know that we're out of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. And now I think we have at least one question in the chat, and then maybe Berivan or Ann-Katrin can read it for us. Ann-Katrin.
Yes, Gustav, we have a question from Lucia, FMV, Unions in the Netherlands, saying that the ILO accepted China on terms that are the same as now in the EU-China CAI. China would work on the implementation of ILO core labor conventions, etc. Over many years, though, nothing has changed. Why would the CAI make the real difference now?
And I think maybe Karolina or Malin, anyone of you who feel that you can answer this question. What do you say, Malin?
Well, I think I raised this. I mean, I don't think there's reason to believe that China will implement this differently than, I mean, China has also ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which includes provisions on freedom of association, and there is no right to form a free and independent trade union in China to this day. So I don't see why China would treat the provisions in the CAI any differently than it has previous international treaties that it has signed. So,
yeah,
I can add on. No, I don't think anybody is expecting that the investment agreement will suddenly revolutionize China's attitude towards international law. But I think that from the EU perspective, it would at least give us a platform to take up a discussion with China on the challenges at hand and build a possibility for a dialogue. How far such dialogue would reach, it's probably hard to tell, but at least there would be a place to meet and discuss these issues. Thank you.
Thank you too. We will have one more question, and then we will look at the movie by Elaine Hui. So, but Andreas, you can comment very, very shortly, at maximum 1 minute, on this question first.
Okay, thanks, Gustav. Let's have a look to the text of the agreement to the sustainability chapter. There, China commits to work towards the ratification of outstanding ILO conventions, fundamental conventions, and takes specific commitments in relation to the 2 fundamental conventions on forced labor that it has not yet ratified. And this is a very awkward formulation which never before has existed in any of the other EU agreements, because it says China will make continued and sustained efforts on its own initiative toward ratification of ILO Conventions 29 and 105 on forced labor. But it falls short of the demands, and that we have to keep in mind. It falls short of the demand of the European Parliament that it should make much more detailed commitments, and that it is also clear in the wording that it would encompass provinces like Xinjiang, excuse me, Tibet and others. So this is, by the way, I mean, the whole sustainability chapter, if you take a close look at that, including the remarks on the Paris Agreement, which China has already signed up to, this is a smokescreen. There is no real progress in those commitments made by the People's Republic of China.
Thank you so much, Andreas. And then 1 second question, and then we will go over to the film. Berivan, do we have a second question?
Yes, Gustav, we have also a question posted by Ulrika. And then a comment, but the actual question is, do Swedish or German unions have any concrete programs with the ACFTU at the moment?
Mm. Thank you very much. Very short answers here. I start with you again, Andreas. Do you have any cooperation projects together with ACFTU?
Yes, we have, and we went to China, to Beijing and Shanghai about 2 years ago, and went to visit a few German companies and saw that China has partly become a highly industrialized, very competitive country. And we also saw how Western investments are used to build on economic expansion, if not hegemony, of China in the network of global value chains.
Thank you. I think we must continue to the move, actually. Oscar, do you have any more?
No, our answer is no on that question. We don't have any cooperation projects.
Yeah. I remember. I think I have heard it also. Okay, we continue to the film then. And I should just present that this is a film with Elaine Hui, who is actually as an associate professor of labor and employment relations at Asian Studies at Pennsylvania State University.
Hello, I am Elaine Hui from the School of Labor and Employment Relations of Pennsylvania State University in the US. I'm the assistant professor in the School of Labor, Employment and Relations there. So I will ask you to discuss about a number of questions about labor politics in China. So the first questions that I'm going to address is about labor organizations in China. So for labor organizations, or what we call labor NGOs in China, for quite a long time, they have been playing a very active role in trying to organize workers. So especially during the last administrations, the Hui era, we saw that a lot of labor NGOs, they are actually having a movement orientations, which means that they do not just simply provide services or legal services or individual services to workers. They also try to organize workers proactively in terms of trying to help them to organize extra union elections during strikes, trying to help organize them to collectively bargain with employers, and try to help them with the protests. So we see that those labor NGOs have taken the opportunities that is arisen during the Hui era, because during the Hui era, we saw that the political environment and the overall social environment has become more liberal, relatively liberal and more open. And there are more experiments that the labor organizations and other civil society organizations that they can try to experiment it. It is against this context that we saw that a lot of labor organizations, they have become more movement oriented. And it is also because in general in China, the workers' class consciousness has arisen. They're more aware of their labor rights, and a lot more workers are more vocal and were willing to take actions to defend the labor rights. So then a lot of labor NGOs staffers and a lot of labor NGOs activists, they felt like it's a good opportunities to try to organize the workers, because workers are now more ready. However, after Xi Jinping, the new government, the new governor or new president in China came into power, we saw that there is a repression of the civil society, including the labor NGOs. And a lot of labor NGOs that were once very active and organized workers, now they were suppressed and they were no longer active. So right now, during the new government's administrations, we see that there's a decline of labor movement within the labor organizations, the labor NGOs. The second question that I'm asked to discuss is about unionizations in China. So in the past few years, we have witnessed a new trend among workers, which is that some workers, when they go on strike or when they went on protest, they demand to set up workplace unions on their own. So unions in China has been monopolized by the official unions, the ACFTU, and ACFTU has been serving as an official trade unions as a state apparatus, and they were not trying to proactively defending workers' genuine right. But then in the past few years, an interesting phenomenon is we saw that is that workers at the workplace level, they try to proactively pursue a legal route to set up a workplace unions in workplace. So for the famous case, the JZIC workers, they were trying to do that. They were trying to set up a workplace unions according to the legal procedures. So, and there are some other cases that I observed and have written about in which the workers, they were trying to establish the unions according to law. But then I observed that, and my studies show that this type of effort is not easy. A lot of workers trying to set up a workplace unions, they met a lot of hurdles from trade unions, employers, and etc. So first of all, the unions at the local level, they were not supportive at all. When workers go to ask them for help to set up a workplace unions, a lot of them, they were reluctant to help them or just ignore their requests. And on the side of the employers, we see that employers are super hostile, very, very hostile, and they would resort to various strategies, including threatening the workers, including firing the workers to try to stop the effort of the workers to build up unions in the workplace. So even though I said that we have witnessed this trend of bottom-up unionizations in China, so far we haven't seen a very successful cases, which means that workers being able to set up a unions at workplace according to the law. But despite this situation, we still feel like the workers, they are making some progress in terms of their understanding of trade union rights in China. Then the third questions I am asked to discuss about is about the future of the labor movement in China. So as I mentioned, trade unions in China, they are monopolized by ACFTU and they are state apparatus. So I predicted that, or a lot of scholars, they would believe that the situations will continue. Trade unions will still be a monopolized business of ACFTU in the near future or in the midterm and long term. And then but Xi Jinping also, after he came into power, as I mentioned, is more repressive of the civil society. Before Xi Jinping, the Huan government administrations, they were kind of also relying on the labor NGOs, labor organizations, and civil society actors to try to pacify the workers and to try to pacify the society in general. But then for Xi Jinping, we observe that he no longer used that strategy. He's very repressive of the civil society and the labor NGOs. Instead, what he was trying to do is to strengthen the party-dominated organs, the party organs, like trade unions, the Communist Youth League, and etc., and many other party organs to try to deal with labor unrest and social unrest. So one trend about the labor movement in China, we believe that is trade union will continue to be used by the party state to pacify the workers, and the party organs, many other party organs still will be used to deal with labor unrest. And then another point of prediction is that for the Huan administrations, they have implemented quite a lot of protective labor laws for workers. So far for Xi Jinping, the new administrations, they haven't implemented any substantial new protective labor laws for workers. Rather, it has implemented some labor laws that help fragmentize or casualize the workforce. So I predict that this trend of not implementing protective labor laws will be continuing in the foreseeable futures. And then the fourth point about the labor movement in China is about the worker struggles. So even though labor NGOs and labor organizations and the civil society in general, they were seriously suppressed, but we haven't witnessed a decline of worker struggles in China. We have seen that workers continue to strike, continue to protest, especially in some new sectors. We also see some worker activisms. For example, the white collars, the office workers, IT workers, and then the delivery workers and service sanitation workers, their struggles continue and their protest continues. So my predictions is that for the labor movement in China, despite the fact that there have been less organizational resources for them to resort to organize themselves, but then their struggles will continue and it might likely to spread to some industries that we haven't seen before. So about the role of Hong Kong trade unions, so far and still, Hong Kong is the only part of China that has allowed for independent trade unions. HKCTU has remained the only independent trade unions in China. And I think it's important for HKCTU to continue to play this role. But then, because of the recent development in Hong Kong, a lot of different sectors have already been fixed by the government or targeted by the government, including the media, including scholars, including the civil servants, including teachers. So it seems likely that trade unions in China or in Hong Kong, trade unions in Hong Kong, they might at a certain point also be attacked or be a target by the Hong Kong government or the Chinese government. So it's very important before that happens that the Hong Kong trade unions and international trade unions try to strengthen the union movement in Hong Kong so that they will continue to be able to act as a democracy advocacy and labor rights advocate in the larger context of China. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine Hui. And Sorry if some of you didn't hear this movie very clearly. For me, it was a bit tricky, but I think it was different. So some of you maybe have. It was easier to hear this movie. It's this kind of problems sometimes happen when you organize these webinars. Now let's go on to panel 2, which is about sustainable business and what companies can do in order to improve workers' rights in China. And then I would like to ask all of the panelists in panel 2 to shut on your cameras. And then I will also introduce you. The first one, Ulrika Sandberg, you are Senior Policy Advisor in Business and Human Rights at Amnesty International in Sweden. Then we have Jerker Hellström, Director at the Swedish Center for China Studies, a quite recently established company, as I understand it. And then we have Henrik Lindholm, Director at Ethical Trading Initiative Sweden, also, as I understand it, quite recently initiated organization. So if you want to, you can say some words about that later. And then we have Stephen Filler, Senior Criteria Manager at TCO Development.
Stephen Fuller.
Stephen Fuller, sorry. Stephen Fuller, thank you. So I thank you, all of you, and I also have to say again that this seminar will be recorded and you can ask questions in the chat. But I would like to give my first questions to you, Jerker. Today, China is Sweden's largest trading partner in Asia, and trade with China has increased steadily during recent years. So how can companies navigate between their international code of conduct and the political and cultural requirement they face in China? What do you say, Jerker?
Thanks, Gustav. Thanks for a great seminar. And as it happens, I've actually created a script that I want to abide by, so to keep basically the time, because I know we're constrained when it comes to time. So let me just start with a short expose of what's happened recently. In just the latest half year, 2 Swedish companies have been affected by the Communist Party's attempts to influence decision makers in other countries, and that's Ericsson and H&M. And in October, the Swedish Telecom Authority, PTS, decided to exclude Chinese companies from Sweden's 5G rollout. And I think you're all familiar with that. But the result was that Chinese state media, diplomats, and other officials began to threaten the company, but also other Swedish firms with sanctions due to this. And these threats are still being repeated by state media. We haven't seen any concrete steps from Beijing yet to act on these threats, and I'm not actually convinced that they will. But then also on the second point, the second company in March, and this was already mentioned by you, Gustav, and others, of course, the EU adopted sanctions on 4 Chinese officials and a construction company for human rights abuses against the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region. This then immediately led to counter sanctions, quite harsh sanctions from China, and also included sanctions on academics and their families. But what also happened was that Chinese consumers initiated a boycott of H&M, the fashion company, which was not officially attributed to the EU sanctions, but obviously linked to the sanctions decision. So actually, instead, the boycott of H&M was motivated by a statement many months earlier in which the company said that it, in fact, did not source products from Xinjiang, but that it would phase out an indirect business relationship with one specific supplier, even though H&M's investigations had shown no indications of forced labor. So, but also the H&M's suppliers had sourced cotton from farms connected to the Better Cotton Initiative, BCI, in the region. And BCI had decided to suspend licensing of cotton from Xinjiang because of the increasing difficulty in conducting credible due diligence in this region. And as a result, H&M suppliers would not source BCI cotton from Xinjiang. But what connects those two cases, the Ericsson case and H&M, is that the fact that these two companies have not been sanctioned for anything that they themselves have done, but actually for decisions made by officials in Europe, including Sweden, of course. And in previous years, companies have adapted to the Chinese party states' red lines on Taiwan, such as including Taiwan on maps of the People's Republic and referring to Taiwan as a province of China rather than as a sovereign state. But what we're seeing now is that foreign companies are being punished for actions by governments in their home markets. This isn't anything new, but it's a leverage that China has in a world where many see the Chinese market as critical to their business. So foreign companies are being used basically as tools for China to exert pressure on governments and other states. And previously, nearly all of these issues were related to China's so-called core interests, non-negotiable and interests that relate to the Communist Party's main ambition being to remain in power. So basically, defending the territory and increasing it also, of course, with parts of East and the South China Seas and Taiwan, of course, which also means that any statements or any kind of communication that challenges the official terminology, the narrative basically, can be met with sanctions or at least threats of sanctions. But the red lines are on a constant change and can be difficult to assess. Of course, they all boil down to the party's emphasis on non-interference in domestic affairs, meaning basically that nobody's allowed to criticize the party. But as China's domestic affairs are increasingly relevant to the international community, this means that decisions made in other countries also in these cases that the party needs to basically send strong signals that it can and these decisions can and will result in threats of repercussions against foreign business interests. So basically, just to wrap up then, I'd like to wrap up with the question that Gustav just mentioned that I set out to discuss here. What about codes of conduct? And I think that they could increasingly come under pressure as China puts more emphasis on silencing any voices that can be interpreted as critical of the party's policies. And I expect this to become increasingly clear as we move closer to the Winter Olympics near Beijing in February, for example, but also, of course, a host of other issues. So what we have to do, and I think this has been said many times before, but I think it needs, I think we need to stress this, that we do have to act together, being companies to the extent possible, and democracies to the extent possible, but also we have to act together with China. Brussels and governments of individual EU member states shouldn't expect that the Chinese officials understand our norms and values. We have to express these priorities not only in words, but also in deeds. A narrative that's often heard in China is that the West is engaged in double standards and that our values are related to human rights are in fact merely a tool to put pressure on China, while we look the other way when it comes to other countries. So I think it's vital that we're able to show this to China as well, that we mean business. In the long run, this will also be in the interest of the companies whose sustainable operations also relating to human rights come under pressure in countries like China. Meanwhile, companies have to become better informed of how the party's red lines are setting the boundaries for business in China, but potentially also globally. But they should also they should also think twice before adapting to the CCP's red lines when they run counter to an individual company's own sustainability policy. And if this isn't obvious to companies, their customers in democratic countries could come to remind them as public opinion seems to have become increasingly sensitive to signals that corporations value certain markets, and mainly China, higher than their own sustainability policies. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerker, and I especially appreciate that you bring up some concrete example of how to move forward. So that's always needed when we come to this discussion about how to handle the relations with China. I continue to Ulrika from Amnesty. And Amnesty, as I understand it, has usually had as a policy to not recommend boycotts against countries, but what do you think? How should we improve human rights in China? How should companies act in order to improve human rights in China?
Yes, thank you so much, Gustav. Thank you for inviting us to this important seminar today. I work on corporate responsibility and human rights at Amnesty in Sweden. And I wanted to bring along to this discussion the civil society perspective on what companies can do in relation to human rights when they're either doing business with China or in China. And we have three main suggestions as Amnesty. The first one is that companies should all conduct what's called human rights due diligence regularly. A human rights due diligence is a process whereby companies identify risks that human rights may be negatively impacted by their own activities or in their supply chains. When we say human rights, of course, we also include labor rights in this definition. That's important to mention. And secondly, we also say that companies, of course, should conduct dialogue with relevant stakeholders in order to discuss human rights and sustainability. We've heard that being mentioned before several times already. And then the third suggestion is that when encountering high risks or problematic issues, Amnesty suggests that companies should try and stay in the country or in the business contract and try and find a solution and not leave. And of course, we have already mentioned a few times here the situation in Xinjiang, which is quite important and also a serious human rights situation. And that may actually lead companies to take a decision to leave the region or leave sourcing from the region. But I just wanted to flesh out a little bit about these three solutions that I raised. First of all, human rights due diligence. That's something which today is only a voluntary method. As I think Cecilia mentioned before, it is in our National Action Plan from 2015, which is based on the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. The analysis should be conducted regularly, and in terms of a high-risk context, we say that should be an enhanced human rights due diligence, so a lot more thorough, including sources such as, of course, civil society reports, but also government documents, research reports, etc. And what we do say is that what we need to do here is to raise the bar. We know that at the moment, conducting human rights due diligence is voluntary. But there is development within the EU to make this a legal requirement. We are expecting a law proposal after the summer from the EU Commission. And that law proposal is, we hear will contain requirements that companies will have to conduct both human rights and environmental due diligence in their operations and also in their value chains. The other aspect that I mentioned is that we suggest companies conduct dialogue with relevant stakeholders. And stakeholders could be unions, of course, civil society, in the sense that there is a civil society, government officials, both at local, regional, and central level. But in the Chinese context, of course, it's important to mention that companies must be aware that the ACFTU, which has already been mentioned before, is not a union in the Swedish sense, and that companies should be aware that dialogue with this union may not represent what is a union dialogue in the Swedish context. And in that sense, I also want to mention that we believe that there's an urgent need for the development of more sectoral unions, perhaps within the construction industry or the transport industry, so that workers' concerns can be better represented and also that there is an effective collective bargaining strategy developed. And then in that particular context, on our second recommendation, I can also mention that we believe that there is a possible role for unions there, of course, to engage and continue, of course, engaging with the ACFTU, and also to push them to reform the ways in which they work for the benefit of workers. Our third recommendation is that companies should find solutions on site or in the location rather than moving away. We always say this, and in particular in the context of the cobalt extraction in the DRC, this is something that we are always highlighting. However, when a company chooses to stay to find solutions, it's important that those solutions and methods are responsibly and are conducted in a responsible and sustainable way. Really key to staying in the field or in the area. However, if human rights due diligence analysis, for example, discover problems that are far too serious or that engagement does not result in any further development, then companies may decide to exit a contract or leave a region and so on. But that's really more or less the final solution, the last solution, and maybe a temporary solution as well. I think I'm quite happy to leave it there and perhaps hand over to the next person, Gustav.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ulrika. And as with Jerker, I really appreciate that you come with these concrete recommendations. So I get on to Stephen, and TISO certified is one of the most advanced sustainability certification of IT products. Most of these products are actually made in China. So I would like to ask you, how do you drive and achieve improvements of workers' rights on production sites in China?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So yeah, this is definitely a very complex issue, and you know, their suppliers in China don't follow local legislation levels and see them, you know, the suppliers see them as ambition levels rather than law, not just because local authorities don't enforce these laws, but also their clients aren't committed, or they're unable to have enough leverage over the supplier to force them to follow the law. Setting social criteria has been, for TISO development, anyway, a learning curve. We found many years ago, back in 2009, when we released our first social responsibility mandate that established code of conducts and being a member of an industry-led program, it's a start, but it's not enough to improve labor rights at the supply level. There has to be more activeness. So presently, some 4 generations of TCO certified later, we use a system of transparency on independent audit results. So we monitor all the final assembly factories of certified products by requiring audit data is shared with us that we subsequently share with the certifying brand owners. This we call the TCO certified accepted factory list. So this form of sharing cuts down not only audit fatigue that many factories experience by individual brand owners appearing at the door to conduct audits on their own lines, but it also helps set up a collaboration of brand owners using the same supplier toward driving and maintaining improvements. But for this to work, there needs to be a level of commitment from the brand owners that allocate sufficient resources to this end. So brand owners doing business with the suppliers need to build up a good working relationship with the supplier and be willing to pay more for the production of their product if they're requiring social and environmental improvements. And on the other side, suppliers want to know that their investment in improvements will be met by longer contracts and not a loss of business to a cheaper, less committed competitor. So a certification is in the position to set up a collaboration of clients to the supplier to increase the leverage on improvements. A company that has a small business percentage of the supplier's total will have very little leverage unless the other clients are requiring the same standards. And also the certification is in a position to implement consequences, which are very important. So a certification can cancel a certificate if improvements aren't met in time, in a certain time. So consequences are important, since the risk of the financial loss of the client or business is the main motivator that works best on the suppliers, and their understanding that, you know, this is a very serious matter. So our way of implementing this and our recommendations are, you know, follow up code of conduct and factory inspections. They're not enough to solve sustainability problems, but there needs to be a set of continuous monitoring, which is necessary. A collaboration, you know, with harmonized requirements and a coordination of action. These elements create greater impact on the suppliers. And also, finally, there has to be consequences that to get the IT industry to prioritize this work to correct, you know, not just health and safety issues, but also the persistent labor law issues and the problems that are identified at the factory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Time goes quick, so we must soon end. But last but not least in the panel, we have Henrik. And I would like you to describe a bit what you do in your organization, ETI, and how you work in order to increase sustainability and respect for human rights.
Thanks. It's been really interesting to hear the previous contributions. I come from a fairly new organization here in Sweden, Ethical Trading Initiative Sweden. We bring together businesses in all sectors, as well as trade unions and civil society organizations working on human rights, to try to understand how we can better support good working conditions and human rights in global supply chain. And the core of what we do is trying to support companies in their due diligence work in their supply chains. Because the difficulty is usually it's the ideas behind them might sound easy, but then when you're actually working on your supply chain, as Stephen said, you know, it's not just auditing and making corrective action plan. It's really engaging with your supply chain and working together with them. And ETI in Norway, Denmark, and the UK has over 20 years of experience with working exactly with this. How can you improve your supply chain? How can you work with it in order to secure good working conditions? And I completely agree with everything Ulrika said, what Cecilia, our ambassador on sustainable business, said, all important points. However, we are faced now in China with quite a special situation. I've been talking to, and all these discussions have been off the record, with companies and organizations doing audits and follow-up of working conditions in China. They don't want to email about this. So we talk on the phone, and they say they do not follow up issues regarding forced labor during their audits. because they are afraid to instruct their local staff to ask questions about minorities being under pressure to be part of poverty alleviation programs. They do not even want to ask factory managers about this, because factory managers might not, well, do not have the choice if they want to be part of poverty alleviation programs that include forced labor. This is a situation, obviously this is not for every business in China, all supply chains, but it becomes absurd when we talk about practicing human rights due diligence, where the center of this is to identify, prevent, and mitigate negative human rights impact. And we are in a situation where people working on the ground with this will off the record say that they will avoid identifying it. And we do not know, any of us, how to prevent and mitigate such a severe violation of human rights as forced labors. Obviously, this is just one part of doing business with China. And there's a lot of good things you can do with your suppliers, anything from creating independent complaint systems, strengthening worker management dialogue, wages, working times, social security issues, etc. But we cannot turn away from the fact that we face a situation where we do not know how to practice human rights due diligence, which is the center of the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, where we have the EU preparing legislation right now. For our members, we've said, you need to track your supply chain, know where you have your suppliers carefully. And you need to practice enhanced due diligence. But also, we know that this enhanced due diligence in the specific cases of minorities under pressure in China is not working now. We can't give good advice, and I've been talking to several organizations, several people working on this, and Gustav, you said you appreciated concrete advice. Well, I don't have any right now, not regarding this. And I think it's a question that needs to be worked on broadly across all sectors and also politically. That said, for the other parts of working on securing working conditions in supply chains, I think there are many tools, and they're very similar in China as in other countries. With the big limitation as well, again, with as everyone has mentioned before, the limitation on free trade unions, which is there's no way around it, but there are ways to work on improving workplace dialogue. Of course, that's the only thing you can do there. Sorry to be a bit of a skunk at the party, but a bit of a despairing comment there from me.
Oh, thank you, Henrik. It's interesting but a bit sad to hear. But you also say that we must continue this discussion about developing concrete action. So now we are already a bit late, but we have some more minutes, I hope. So I want to ask my colleagues if you have any question. I think we have time for one of the questions, perhaps. What do you say, Berivan?
Yes, Gustav, we actually have a question from Marianne from CSR Sweden, saying right now it is almost impossible to have a dialogue with the civil society without exposing them to a risk. What should you do then? When should a company leave a market that is almost impossible to ensure that human rights are not violated? Exposing them to a risk. What should you do then?
I don't know who of you feel comfortable to answer. We have Andreas here raising his hand. What do you say, Andreas?
Just briefly that, sadly, as it may sound, I can only confirm what Henrik was just saying on enhanced human rights due diligence in companies that operate in China. We are making the same experiences, and this is not just about German companies operating in Xinjiang, but everywhere. This has become relevant to us in the context of our national legislation on a law on human rights due diligence for German companies. So I think this is actually a very important benchmark when European legislation will come on the table, on the agenda in June or July, presented by Didier Reynders. It should be used from all of us in the European trade union movement to close our ranks and state very clearly to the European institutions what we expect in terms of sustainability, human rights, labor rights in relations between Europe and China.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Before we end the seminar, I will give the word to Oscar, who can wrap up a summary of this discussion, but I will also give you a question, Oscar, and the question is originally from Jerker, and it is: how will TCO continue working with the suggestions that has been raised during this seminar, and how will TCO work with ACFTU in the future? Do you have any comments on that, Oscar?
Well, thanks very much, Gustav, and thanks very much for two great panel discussions. First of all, to the questions, I actually got them from our staff here, a little rerun. The first one was on how we will follow up the suggestions. Well, this seminar is actually part of a broader discussion we have on how to deal with China and what kind of policies should we pursue on this matter. So I think we will take this into the discussion. But I also think, and that's what I would like to share with Andreas at a later stage, of course, is how we can discuss these kind of issues further in the ETUC, the European Trade Union Confederation, where this really needs to be discussed, I think. The ETUC has come up with a suggestion, for instance, on that the EU needs to take a global strategy on China, where, I mean, trade policy, and this is only a part, but like a comprehensive strategy on how to deal with this country, because it's a situation that is, I think some of the panelists mentioned, that is different from every other situation in the world. It's becoming the largest economy, and it deserves kind of special thinking and treatment to be able to handle this. And the other question was about cooperation with ACFTU. Well, same answer there. We'll have to take this into our internal discussions, see what we can do, and also discuss with our colleagues in ELO and SACO, for instance, the other on the Swedish side with the other confederations as well. So I could come back to that later. But just to wrap up, it's, as you said, we should summarize this. That's quite difficult always to summarize a diverse panel like this. But I think we got some really interesting tips and, perspectives from different persons and different angles and so on. I think in the first panel, I think we got quite a pessimistic view about the situation in China, of course. Andreas mentioned that it's business rather than change, for instance. Then we dig down a little bit in the KAI, in the investment agreement that has now, well, at least been frozen by the European Parliament for the time being. Where I think the Amnesty and Malin really raised that why should China comply with this kind of requirements in a KAI when they don't comply with other requirements in other treaties and so on? whereas I know the National Board of Trade and Karolina was a little bit more positive and saw this as an opportunity for discussion and so on. Cecilia noted how the Swedish government is working actually, for instance, with a memorandum of understanding on corporate sustainability. Then we had Elaine Hui, the professor from Pennsylvania. I know that I don't think the panel actually all heard you because there was kind of a technical problem with the sound, but I rushed into a room nearby to listen, and I know she gave us some hope. She actually talked about how workers in China, even though they can't formally unionize, they are actually working and continue to struggle to try to organize in some way or another to fight for their rights, and that they actually know their rights, despite the fact the state is getting more and more control of the situation and it becoming more and more repressive. Then on the panel too, I think we got some concrete tips from Jerker that mentioned that Europe has to express values in deeds, that we have to practice what we preach. I think that's quite an interesting thing to think about more. Ulrika from Amnesty told about the human rights due diligence legislation and the role of the unions, which of course we think is particularly important, that we could contribute from the trade union side in this kind of work. Stephen at TCO Development talked about certification, how certification could contribute to build pressure on factories, for instance, and play a constructive role there. And then Henrik, who claimed to be the skunk at the party, mentioned actually forced labor. How can we do due diligence when we face such a challenge like forced labor, for instance? And I think these are very interesting perspectives. And even though we don't have the final recipe on how to deal with China and human rights today, gave us some really interesting insights. So thank you very much to the two interesting panels, to Gustav, our moderator and helper in our China policy work, and of course also to my colleagues Berivan and Ann-Katrin and the other people at our communication department who have made this seminar possible. So hope to see you again, and thank you for everyone who was listening as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.